What if the most dangerous place isn't a dark alley, but the one you walk through every day without thinking twice? Juliana Torres wasn't running. She wasn't lost. She wasn't breaking rules or chasing danger. She was in a normal place, on a normal day, doing something completely ordinary. And that's exactly why this case unsettles so many people. Because nothing in the scene screamed crime. Nothing warned her. Nothing warned anyone watching from the outside. True crime stories often try to comfort us with a simple explanation, a sudden snap, a moment of rage, a loss of control. But what if that explanation is the lie that keeps us blind? What if this wasn't an impulsive murder at all, but the final step of a psychological process already in motion? A mind observing, evaluating, waiting for the right moment to blend into the ordinary. Because when a crime happens in a place like this, the real question isn't what she did wrong. It's whether the danger was ever in the location, or always inside the mind that was watching her long before the attack began. And as we go deeper into this story, I want you to stay active in it with me. If at any moment, something here feels familiar, unsettling, or makes you rethink how you see everyday situations, let me know in the comments. That conversation matters. If this kind of psychological true crime analysis helps you understand how these minds really work, a quick like tells me to keep going in this direction. And if you want to, keep learning how to spot patterns, manipulation, and hidden risk where most people see nothing, subscribe and stay with us, because what happened to Juliana didn't start at the moment of the crime. It started long before anyone realized they were part of someone else's process. One of the most dangerous mistakes we make when trying to understand violent crime is believing in the idea of the snap, the moment where someone just loses it, where reason disappears, control collapses, and chaos takes over. It sounds comforting, almost humane, because it suggests unpredictability. If it was a sudden break, then no one could have seen it coming. No warning signs, no patterns, just bad luck. But that explanation doesn't hold up when you actually look at how violent minds develop. In reality, most homicides don't explode out of nowhere. They build quietly, in plain sight, inside a psychological pressure system that keeps tightening over time. Think of it less like a lightning strike and more like stress fractures in a structure. Tiny cracks that form long before the collapse. The frustration that never gets processed. The resentment that doesn't fade but hardens. The feeling of being overlooked, disrespected, or quietly humiliated in everyday interactions. None of this makes headlines. None of it looks dramatic, but it accumulates. Inside that kind of mind, emotions don't flow outward. They compress. Control becomes a fixation. Not control over life, but control over others, over moments, over outcomes. And when that need for dominance mixes with routine exposure to ordinary environments, parking lots, sidewalks, stores, public spaces, the danger doesn't announce itself. It blends in. That's why so many cases feel confusing after the fact. People say the attacker seemed normal, calm, invisible, because they were never operating in chaos. They were operating in rehearsal. This is where behavioral psychology and forensic profiling quietly overlap. What looks like impulse is often permission, a mental green light given after weeks, months, sometimes years of internal justification. The crime doesn't create the mindset. The mindset authorizes the crime. By the time the act happens, the emotional debate is already over. What remains is execution, not emotion. Understanding this matters, not for morbid curiosity, but for awareness. Because once you stop believing in the myth of the random outburst, you start noticing how certain personalities interact with space, with routine, with perceived vulnerability. You begin to see how risk is less about location and more about psychological readiness. And that shift in perspective changes how you interpret the silence before violence, the part that almost always goes unnoticed, yet carries the clearest signals of what's coming. When you step into the mindset that precedes a crime like this, one thing becomes clear very quickly. The aggressor isn't hunting a specific name, face, or identity. He's scanning for conditions, the right combination of routine, access, and distraction, a space that feels familiar enough to lower defenses, a moment that looks ordinary enough to pass unnoticed. This is situational awareness turned predatory, shaped by a mind that has already rehearsed outcomes long before acting on them. That's why so many violent crimes happen in places people consider safe, not because those places are dangerous by nature, but because predictability creates opportunity. The aggressors, Internal logic isn't emotional chaos, it's pattern recognition. He notices who moves alone, who follows habits, who assumes normalcy equals safety. This isn't about rage boiling over. It's about waiting, observing, letting the environment do part of the work. In this state of mind, there's no dramatic inner monologue about murder, no cinematic decision point. The thought process is quieter, almost practical. If the situation aligns, if the variables fall into place, the action feels justified internally. The moral line was crossed earlier during weeks or months of rationalization. By the time the moment arrives, it doesn't feel extreme to him. It feels inevitable. That's why it matters to say this clearly. Juliana wasn't targeted for who she was. There was nothing unique she did to invite danger. She simply fit into a mental framework that already existed. The aggressor brought the risk with him. The location didn't create the threat, it revealed it. This distinction is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that danger is always obvious. It forces us to accept that risk often hides behind normal routines, everyday environments, and subtle power imbalances. Once you understand this, you stop looking only at places and start paying attention to behavior, posture, timing, and context. You begin to see how certain minds move through public space differently, how intent doesn't announce itself, but leaks through small choices. And that shift, from fearing the wrong location to recognizing the wrong psychology, changes how the entire story starts to come into focus, especially when we move closer to the moment where opportunity turns into action. When the moment arrives, what surprises most people is how little chaos there actually is. From the outside, violence looks explosive, irrational, driven by rage. But inside the aggressor's mind, it often feels controlled, narrow, almost quiet. This is where the myth of losing control completely falls apart. During the act, many offenders are not overwhelmed by emotion. They are locked into task-oriented thinking. Attention tightens, distractions fade. The world compresses into a sequence of actions and outcomes. This is a state of dominance, not frenzy. Control of the victim's movement, control of the pace, control of what happens next. Time feels different here, stretched and slowed, because the mind is focused on execution rather than reflection. There's no internal debate about morality in this window. That debate already ended long before. What remains is decision-making under self-imposed rules, guided by rehearsal and expectation. That's why so many crimes appear calculated afterward. The positioning, the timing, the choice of moment. These aren't signs of brilliance or intelligence. They're signs of preparation. Even when the situation changes, the aggressor adapts because the goal stays fixed. This is situational awareness used destructively, filtered through a mindset that values control above consequence. The danger isn't emotional overflow, it's emotional absence. In this phase, anger isn't driving the behavior, permission is. A silent internal agreement that the action is acceptable, justified, or necessary. And once that agreement is in place, the body follows with efficiency. That's what makes this so unsettling. The lack of visible struggle inside the aggressor doesn't mean there's no conflict. It means the conflict has already been resolved. If you want to learn how to recognize these patterns before they turn into irreversible moments, subscribe now. This isn't about consuming crime as entertainment. It's about understanding risk, psychology, and prevention through clarity. Because once control replaces chaos, the story moves into a phase where the real consequences begin to surface, and the mind that seemed so focused starts revealing what it was trying to protect all along. What often unsettles people the most isn't the violence itself, but what comes after it, the silence, the return to normal rhythms. For many aggressors, the emotional peak doesn't happen during the act. It happens in the aftermath, when the noise stops and the mind finally gets what it was pushing toward. Not panic, not collapse, but a strange internal calm that feels like resolution. This is where rationalization takes over. The mind begins rewriting the event almost immediately, trimming details, softening consequences, reshaping reality into something tolerable. Harm is minimized, responsibility is shifted. The narrative becomes cleaner, simpler, easier to live with. In behavioral science, this is a well-documented coping mechanism, but here it's not about healing, it's about preservation, preserving the self-image, the sense of control, the illusion that the outcome was necessary or deserved. That's why immediate remorse is rare. Movies teach us to expect shaking hands, breakdowns, sudden guilt. Real life is quieter. Many offenders experience a distorted sense of relief as if a long-standing internal tension has finally been released. Some even describe it as a task completed, a problem solved. This doesn't mean they feel no emotion. It means their emotions are organized around justification, not empathy, because the mind rehearsed this phase too. Long before the crime, it imagined explanations, alibis, future conversations. That mental preparation allows them to lie convincingly, to speak calmly, to return to work, family, routine. From the outside, this looks chilling. From the inside, it feels consistent. The story they tell others is often the same story they've already told themselves. Understanding this changes how we interpret post-crime behavior. Normalcy isn't innocence. Calm isn't clarity. Sometimes it's the strongest signal that the psychological process didn't begin or end with the act itself. It continued seamlessly, carrying forward the same logic that allowed the crime to happen in the first place. And when you start paying attention to that silence, to what isn't said or shown, you begin to notice how much information hides in the aftermath, quietly pointing back to everything that was already in motion, long before anyone realized something was wrong. What stays with you after a case like this isn't just the names or the details. It's the realization that danger rarely announces itself the way we expect. The story of Juliana Torres isn't only about a victim and an aggressor crossing paths. It's about a collective misunderstanding we carry. That threat always looks threatening, that risk always feels obvious, that violence arrives with warning signs loud enough to hear. Real life doesn't work that way. What makes this case uncomfortable is how ordinary everything looked on the surface. And that discomfort is useful, because once you accept that this wasn't a sudden loss of control, but an invisible psychological process unfolding over time, your perspective shifts. The crime wasn't a surge of emotion. It was a mindset moving quietly through familiar spaces, guided by assumptions, routines, and moments we're taught not to question. The value of understanding cases like this isn't fear, it's clarity. Learning to notice patterns instead of places, behaviors instead of stereotypes. The subtle ways certain individuals relate to control, proximity, and vulnerability. This kind of awareness isn't paranoia, it's psychological literacy. It's the same skill set used in threat assessment, situational awareness, and personal safety training, translated into everyday life. When you start looking at violence through this lens, you realize how often the warning signs exist without spectacle. A fixation on dominance, a comfort with violating boundaries, a calm that doesn't match the situation. These signals don't guarantee harm, but they matter, and recognizing them early can change outcomes. That's why stories like this deserve to be examined carefully, without sensationalism, without excuses, not to relive the horror but to extract the lesson hidden inside it. Because the most important part of true crime isn't what happened, it's what it teaches us about the minds that make it possible. The place seemed wrong only in hindsight, but for that mind shaped long before the moment arrived, it wasn't wrong at all. It was familiar, it was quiet, and it fit perfectly. If you stayed until here, it tells me something. It means this way of looking at crime, through psychology, patterns, and quiet warning signs, makes sense to you. That's exactly what this channel is about. So if this kind of analysis helps you see the world with a little more clarity and awareness, subscribing is just a way of staying connected to that perspective. If you want, leave a comment saying, "I saw it differently." It lets me know you made it to the end and that this story actually landed. And if this conversation held your attention, a like is a simple way of saying that this kind of content matters and should keep coming. There's a video right here that expands on this same mindset from another real case. Click and keep going with me there.